2 days, 120 slides. There are rules of thumb for how many minutes you do on a slide. We have covered a lot of detail. We are now going to cover how to configure the Wakespeed regulator. And guess what? That is 12 slides. A tenth of this entire presentation. This is how good we are. We only need a tenth of the information to tell you how to configure the regulator and take advantage of all these great features. There are quite a few ways to configure the regulator. The very simplest way is connect this regulator up to an RVC compliant battery. Do you remember when we talked about CAN protocols and we said the fundamental thing that this thing runs on is RVC? You pull this out of the box, you connect this wire up to the battery, and you go have lunch. Providing, if you'll remember the other day, we talked about the defaults we use for the alternator. If those match your needs, 100 degrees C, 90% drive, if those are within the criteria of your alternator, that's literally all you have to do. The Wakespeed regulator will recognize that there's somebody smarter than it out there. It will do its color shift to orange, yellow, and start following the BMS, providing it is a proper and fully compliant RVC battery. We list those on our website, the ones we've tested, but there are an increasing number of RVC batteries coming on market. So be aware of that. That is absolutely the easiest way. Click it, click and go. Yes, sir.
Are there some improperly configured batteries on the market that you guys run across? And if so, is there also a stay away list that you guys provide?
There is not a stay away list that we provide because it's bad form. There is a list of batteries that we know absolutely work. And then in terms of your other question about the in-betweens, you know, I'm aware of 3 RVC batteries, new ones on the market. I have 2 of them in my lab, 1 of them I don't have. The 2 actually do a pretty good job. The devil in the detail is that it meets the spec. We talked about messages of forewarning, of the BMS getting upset and saying, stop doing that. Of the BMS saying, you really better stop doing that or I'm going to call you home. And the BMS saying, I'm done, I'm out, and does a disconnect. That is all defined in the RVC spec. What's also defined in the RVC spec is this magic 2 seconds heads up. Before a BMS does a disconnect, it must send a CAN message that says, we are going to issue a disconnect command 2 seconds before it actually disconnects. And the reason for that is it takes an alternator about half a second to spool that energy down. The reason why I wrote 2, and I'm the one who wrote 2 seconds in, the reason I wrote 2 seconds is it lets me lose 1 or 2 of those CAN messages. They come out twice a second. See how that works? If he's sending, I'm going to do a disconnect, and that one gets swallowed or lost or corrupted, I'm going to do a disconnect. I can lose 2, get the 3rd one, have time to safely shut down. That's kind of the thinking that went back in all this stuff. If a battery is truly designed to the RVC spec, plug and go and you're safe. Whether or not a battery is truly designed to the RVC spec, I can't answer. And specifically, the area that is often the trouble is that forewarning, because it's a unique thing for alternator regulators because of the high residual magnetism in the alternator. Solar panel controllers don't care. You can say, you can disconnect instantly and the solar panel control will be fine. AC chargers, disconnect instantly. It's actually not true. AC chargers, some of the really big ones, they have residual induction in it, and it will be an issue. Alternators, the Wakespeed instantly responds and it takes its foot off the blue wire, stops driving the alternator. It's called an inductive kick. Lots of energy has to go somewhere. And if it can't go in the battery, it goes into your refrigerator and your electronics, and you end up writing a $20,000 check and putting the fire out in your refrigerator. So that's the danger, and I can't answer the question unless literally we have an example of their battery in our lab and we can verify it. And the easiest way to know that is to see if it's on the Wakespeed app. If it's on here, we have an example of it. If it's not, we don't know. And I will tell you, there were some batteries that we supported, and they stopped talking to me. I'm the guy who signs off on this stuff. When the engineer on the other side doesn't pick up the phone or answer my emails, we pulled their batteries off because we don't know. There's changes happening in the industry, and one particular battery manufacturer specifically, they'd gone through a number of ownership changes. We had no idea what their new batteries looked like, and they wouldn't answer my emails, so we pulled them from our list. I just didn't know. I know it's not a comfortable answer, but that's the reality. And if you want to test it yourself, you can get an alternator without avalanche diodes, drive it real hard, put those batteries in a disconnect, and see if your refrigerator catches on fire. That's the way you could test it at home. All right, but that is absolutely the easiest and simplest way. And there are batteries out now that support RVC. There are batteries coming. And I am going to do a little advertorial here right now. Today, I'm wearing the Legacy Wakespeed logo. You can't get these anymore. This is a classic. Rick has one on his hat. But you'll notice his shirt says Dragonfly Energy. Remember, Dragonfly makes lithium batteries. They make battle-born batteries. By the way, I get paid extra for this. This is, goes into my bonus. They make battle-born batteries, branded batteries. They also make Dragonfly Energy branded batteries. They're largely the same. One's targeted for consumers, one's targeted for the OEM market. This January, we announced a evolution, improvement. We announced a new series of batteries called Dragonfly Intelligence. That's going to add several features to our batteries, to our Dragonfly batteries. It will add the ability for the battery to communicate out to the consumer. There's a cell phone app that comes with those batteries, so you can go on know what's going on with the batteries. It'll also add the ability for the batteries to communicate via CAN, via RVC, to the Wakespeed regulator. It'll also communicate out to NEMA 2000. It'll communicate out to the Victron. It's bringing this whole communication world in, and it's going to be rolling out over this period of time. You know, it was announced in January, and I'm not allowed to talk about dates, and yes, I did ask last night what I could say, and I was told to say, sometime this year. So be looking for it as you're thinking about your batteries. I hope maybe one of the dots you connect. Wakespeed has a very long history with these high energy systems. Wakespeed joined Dragonfly Energy a year ago. Dragonfly Energy is making a new line of batteries to deliver high energy systems. And I'll let you connect the dots from there. Okay, did I earn my keep? I got a thumbs up, thank you. All right, the next simplest way to configure the regulator, if you're doing a legacy, this is like lead acid batteries specifically is probably the best thing. Hook up your shunt, hook up your temperature sensor, set your dip switches. We used to have a little card, and I saw one floating around, and I didn't bring any with me. Just a little, half-sheet card that showed the dip switch settings. You can go online, you can see it. You can go and see the user's manual and stuff, and it'll talk about what the dip switch settings say. You set the dip switches for what the battery charge profile is. You set the dip switches for approximately the battery capacity, and that'll be good enough, especially for a lead acid battery. That's the second easiest way to do this. I will give a caution. One of the charge profiles, is it number 5? Yeah. I think it's number 5. We made a change. In prior versions of firmware, it selected carbon foam, AKA Firefly branded batteries. Firefly, I don't know, we've talked a little bit about, they've had some troubles. We have taken that out from the built-in charge profile, and now, conveniently, it has the battle-born charge profile. So just know that when you find that documentation, if it says Firefly or carbon foam, that's not what that dip switch setting does. So like dips, I think dips 3, 4, and 5 are the ones you select your battery. Is it AGM? Is it battle-born? Is it lead acid? That's how you select the battery type. I believe dips 7 and 8, select the approximate capacity, how many amp hours is it, or 6 and 7. 6 and 7 does battery capacity, and then number 8 is the swap out mode. That's the second easiest way. Hook up your shunt, hook up your temperature sensor to the battery, set your dip switches, and Bob's your uncle. If you've got 2 regulators, connect them together with the CAN bus. Make sure you put the appropriate black terminators on each end. One regulator will be green, the other will be orange. That means that guy's enslaved, and that's a pretty good indication that you have a working system. Yes, sir?
So since you mentioned there's a couple nameless brands under testing in your lab, as those do or do not get added to the approved list?
It's a living list.
Yeah.
It's a living list.
Will there be a new dip switch block that has to be bigger, or will
No.
you just piggyback those brands onto one of the settings in there?
So they're kind of, the question was, I don't know if you heard about it, but as more brands are proofed in the lab, will we be adding more dip switches? They're really not related. To be candid, the dip switches is kind of the big crayon. You know, it's the grade school crayon box where you had 8 crayons, and that's, you know, you picked the color, it was close enough. And, you know, you sometimes went out of the lines, but you know what? Your mom still put it on the fridge. That's what the dip switches are. When we talk about the battery by model number and make that you do with the app, dip switches are ignored. Inside the app, there's actually a database that has all the parameters for those given batteries. What are their capacity? What is their voltage? What do they want to see? What CAN protocol do they use? That's all behind, and that's squirted into the regulator, and it just overrides all the dip switches. Okay? All right. And that is actually the simple and best way to configure the regulator. And that's what we're going to do after our lunch break, is we're going to use the Wakespeed app, and we're going to actually create a configuration. Just, yeah. There is another way, and I think there's only one person in this, well, there's 2 people in this room that might do this. Oh, maybe 3, I don't know. The hard way is, on this slide, the deep dark magic of ASCII. ASCII is a communication standard in computers that lets you, when you have the letter A, it's the way the letter A is represented. When you have the number 1, it's the way the number 1 is represented. The Wakespeed regulator communicates and is configured through the USB port through a series of ASCII strings. You can download that 100-page document that will put most of you to sleep and use a text editor and create those ASCII strings and squirt it into the regulator. That's the hard way to do it. The reason why that existed, and this is actually a bit of folklore, way back when I first did this thing like 10 years ago, a chap was going to write a cell phone app to go with my open source regulator. So I made the regulator and I said, we're going to communicate with ASCII. And there's a computer science reason for doing that, because it's transportable. Everybody knows what the letter 1 looks like in ASCII. Everyone knows what the letter, or the number 1, everyone knows what the letter A looks like in ASCII. It doesn't matter whether you're on a cell phone or an Apple or a Windows or a microcontroller, ASCII is ASCII and it's universal. Unlike if we sent a binary representation of that number, this guy may treat that binary number in what's called little indent. This guy may treat it in big indent. And you have to know how each guy treats it. You have to know what the binary format is. It's complicated. Using ASCII is just a universal way to do it. That is why the Wakespeed regulator uses ASCII to communicate. It was designed for communicating between configuration applications and the Wakespeed regulator in a way that was not prone to errors. It also happens to be human readable. So when you get guys who really want to get in the dirt, they'll get their text editor out and they'll type $SCT, system configure TAC, : 100. They'll type that ASCII command. As we moved forward, this guy who was going to write the cell phone app bugged on me. And I don't know how to write apps. So for the longest time, the only way you could configure the regulator was through those ASCII commands. If you go to our website, on the device tab, you can download, you saw where I showed you to download little PDF files. You'll notice there's a configuration file associated with it. That's actually a pre-typed configuration file. You can see all the ASCII commands, and there's a little manual that's about 20 pages long. They'll tell you which 2 or 3 in there you might really care. It'll say, that number right there is the number you change for the alternator temperature. If you want it to be 100, you have it 100. If you want 90, you make it 90. This number here is how you change the D-rate value. You want 100%, put 0.1 in, or you put 1.0. If you want it to be 90%, you put 0.9. All those things are defined, and we have a nice little cheat manual, and my partner Rick did it because he looked at the big 100-page manual and went, yeah, no, we're not making people read that. So he made a nice little short manual, and he highlighted the 2 or 3 that you most commonly would change. What is your battery capacity? What is the alternator temperature? What are the D-rate values? Those are the most common ones to change. That's the hard way to do it. But you can do it if you want to. I don't recommend you do it. To be honest, I actually use the app all the time now. I used to hand edit these things all the time. I use the app. Yes, ma'am?
When did you get the app?
The app's about, what, 2 years old? Yeah. And the app is growing. At first, its focus was configuration, how to create a configuration file. We've been adding features. There's monitoring functions now. You can update the firmware with it. You can do all sorts of great things with the app now. We are focusing more and more on the app. This ASCII communication, you had to use a Windows computer to transfer to the regulator. And there are times with the app, especially if you have an iPhone, you have to use potentially a Windows computer to get to the regulator itself. But we're moving away from Windows because we're finding more and more problems with Windows. Don't know why. We don't write, Wakespeed, don't write any of this low-level stuff on how a Windows computer connects to the Wakespeed regulator. It's done by STMicro, make a little microchip in here. Drivers are getting installed incorrectly. We've had customers who've had computers that have been working. Something happened last August. I had about 6 customers come in and say, hey, how come my lab computer doesn't work anymore? We don't know. Microsoft pushed out an update, and all of a sudden those machines didn't work. We'll have a little hints on trying to get around that. But more and more, all of our development efforts is on the app. Yes, ma'am?
Are there any plans to make the app work for Mac OS?
Not for Mac OS, no. I thought you were going to ask another question. But I will tell you definitively, no, not for Mac OS.
Question, so it talks, I guess, how does the configuration get from your iPhone or mobile device to Wakespeed? Is it via Bluetooth?
So this is the question I thought she was going to ask. So today, if you have an Android phone, and we're definitely, there's slides on this, but we're going to talk about it now. If you have an Android phone, you use what's called an on-the-go cable. They're like $2. They're like $7 at Amazon and $2 at Alibaba. You plug this into your phone, and this end looks like just a standard USB cable. You then plug this in to the adapter, the on-the-go adapter. This is really important. It changes the behavior of the Android device. It's not just changing the connectors. There's actually something in here that causes the Android device to become a master as opposed to a slave device. You have to use the OTG cable. And then you plug this into the Wakespeed regulator. And that does 2 things. It provides power to the logic side, so you can do this on your desk, right? You don't have to have it installed. And it'll also allow communication down to it. If you're using an Apple device, Apple said, you're not an Apple device. There's no way you're plugging something into our phone. So you can't do it with an Apple device. You have to create the configuration file and then email it to a Windows computer to send it down or an Android device. I will answer the question that you kind of implied. Well, that sounds all great and fine, but everything's better with Bluetooth. Why do I have to use this cable? I cannot talk about future products. I will tell you that a wireless communication is one of the highest requested features to expand on the Wakespeed. And that's, I'm looking at the attorney here. That's probably all I can say. Okay? All right. Let's go ahead and just do a couple more slides here. Here we are the very simplest way to do it, RVC, you set it up. Do you remember I talked about instances on RVC, on the instances? There are instances for the battery. And when you plug in and use just connected, plug and go, dip switches 1 and 2 let you define the instance. RVC recognizes that you might have a house battery and a starter battery and maybe a generator battery, and all of those batteries can live on the RVC network. So when you send information out or listen for information, you have to match the instance. If you're just going to do this super simple way, you just plug it in, you'll have to set the dip switches. By and large, dip switch 1 and 2 will be off. That's the default. That means house batteries. But if you get a situation where you have a complex install with multiple batteries that you have multiple regulators trying to talk to, that's how you adjust that with the dip switches. Realistically, if you're in that type of environment, you're probably going to the cell phone app, to the app in Cradium. Okay? I already mentioned the RVC spec you can download from here. Kindle 2000, richer, large number, blah, blah, blah. All this stuff we covered. Key walkaway is that is what the Wakespeed is based on. Even when we bring in these alternative programs, alternative protocols like SMA and Lux and the Victron links and MG Energy, all that stuff, we actually translate those into RVC messages. So the Wakespeed thinks he's always talking to an RVC battery, even though we bring in different CAN protocols. Okay? Dip switches, here we go. Again, 1 and 2 is the battery instance. This is used for reporting. Here's the battery type. This is the one right here that I was talking about. Dips 3, 4, and 5. It's now battle-born. It's a drop-in lithium battery, and we'll talk about how that works and why we feel comfortable with it later. But that's the one that's changed. The older one, that is where the Firefly was at. And it's not there anymore. That's the one you want to be aware of. 7 and 8 define your battery capacity. So this is how that works. You can define them in 250 amp hour steps. Doesn't matter the voltage. This is the amp hour capacity of the battery. So 24 volt battery, if it's a 200 amp hour battery at 24 volts, you're going to do this. If it's a 500 amp hour battery at 24 volts, you're going to pick one of these two. You're not going to like divide it in half because it's 24 volts. It's what is the amp hour capacity of the battery. Then we already talked about small out mode. Okay. Hopefully this is a review. This was meant to be the deep dive, but we've covered all this information already. Is there any questions on this, on the dip switches? Yes, sir.
You said it used to be the Firefly?
Yes.
So if I didn't do a firmware update, would I still have the Firefly in my...
Yes. I think version 2.5.0 is when we made this change. And what you can do, speaking of versions, that 100-page document I keep referring to, so our marketing department will do a little release note and a blurb when we have firmware update. If you want to know what the details are, it's documented in the first page of that 100-page document. Whenever we do a firmware update, we release a companion to that 100-page document. We'll have a change log in the beginning, and we also will highlight in that document things that have changed, usually with the color red, so you can scan through quickly. If you're the guy that has spent the time to read that whole bloody thing, you can scan through pretty quickly and see where the changes are. Okay. The easiest way to do it, and this is what I'm going to recommend, I am absolutely going to recommend, personally, if you're putting in golf cart batteries, 2 or 4 of them, do dip switches and get on with life if you're happy with the alternator. If you want to get more refined and take more customized and optimized, then you'll do the app. The reason why is, remember we said lead acid batteries are pretty forgiving. So those dip switches saying you're somewhere between 250, 500 amp hours, well, you know what, when we make that tail current decision, we'll be in the ballpark. We'll probably be okay. If you're doing a lithium ion battery, you can do the dip switches, but I'd recommend not. I'd recommend going to this because we want to be more precise. Then the other aspect that you'll definitely want to drive to this is if you want to change parameters on your alternator or any other advanced features. So from my perspective, I would use today one of 2 ways. Very simple, afternoon work, a couple of Trojans, you can get away with the dip switches. Anything else, just use the app. It only takes about 5 minutes, and you'll have something that's optimized and customized and a perfect fit for that particular solution. Okay? On the app, and I'm coming over here to look to see, yeah. So on the app, we allow you to configure, update, monitor, and do diagnostics with your Wakespeed. Some of this requires connection to the actual regulator itself, but you can create configurations on either the iPhone or the Android version. When you're connected to the Wakespeed, you can transfer that configuration down, you can update the firmware. There's a monitor page where you can see dials and gauges, so real quick checkout. You can turn on what's called expert mode that unlocks other features that you can see. So for example, that dial and gauges, in addition to seeing what the battery voltage and current is, you can see what is the current goals and limits. So that's a quick way for you to really diagnose what's going on. You can take a log file, and that is a running list of these ASCII strings. And that is something you can go back to later, study that 100-page manual, specifically one section on AST, and you can see a trend. You can see what the regulator is doing over time. You can see it starting up. You can see when it's getting connection from the CAN BMS. You can see where the BMS is asking for this or not asking for this. You can see where the regulator might be standalone and has gone from bulk to absorption to float. You can see all those transitions over time. You can see how the alternator is going to heat up. A lot of this kind of stuff, and assuming we have time at the end of the day, I'm going to give some hints on this. Because when you're doing troubleshooting, this is like the advanced troubleshooting. You don't want to just know what's going on now. You want to see what's happening over time. You'd be amazed what you can learn by looking at trends over time through these ASCII logs. Okay? We're going to break for lunch now. When we come back, we're going to do 3 things. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a configuration for that system back there. And at some time, we're going to go back and do a live spin and configure it and see it work. We're also going to talk about how to approach bring up and diagnostics. And then we're going to talk about some more advanced ways to use some of these tools we've been talking about and ways that we have found successful to approach. So I think at that point. All right, so what we're going to do now is talk more about the Wakespeed regulator and the gory details of how you configure it. A lot of the stuff we already kind of alluded to. The book, this is this document, 100 pages. It gets updated with every version of firmware that comes out. You'll be able to see what the changes are in that particular firmware at a high level. We don't put all the gory details in, but we put 20 or we put the stuff you need to know, right? There is documentation on the pinouts. Like for example, this is the actual pinout of that RJ45 jack. That's in this document. There's sections on about how you send data to the regulator, how you send it from the regulator. I made mention of the log files. There's this command, there's this status, AST, alternator status, comes out once a second. When you capture a log file, it's going to be a whole bunch of AST lines with our stuff sprinkled in. You can capture that, pull it out, email it to your computer, open it up and study it. And this is the decoder ring, okay? The other purpose of this is all the fault codes. So we've got user guides that have a summary of fault codes, but all of the gory details and every single one of them is listed in here. I just go straight to this document. For the user guide, we kind of cherry pick the ones you're most likely to get. You go to this. When we add new faults, they'll be documented in here. We also have the third-party connections that we use in terms of, I'm sorry. We also, this is a document that really, there's only, well now I can see there's only one person in this room that should truly have to study it, because the other guy's gone. This is, remember I talked about how this ASCII communication is a common computer science way for different entities to talk with each other. In addition to the Wakespeed app, there are other third-party products that I want to make mention of. That's what this last bullet line is here. We have got a company, one of our partners, Off Grid Storage Solutions. They have made an application that you run on a Windows computer I think they may have done an Apple or maybe not. They were talking about it. You run it on a Windows computer, you can hook it up to the Wakespeed regulator, and it'll capture information, show graphs, and it'll let you enter these commands. That's a third-party product. One of our other partners, Ocean Planet Energy, if any of you know Nigel or Bruce, they are part of Ocean Planet Energy. They've created a standalone product called a Tether that is kind of akin to a servo in the sense that it lives on the CAN network. It can receive and send information to the Wakespeed regulator and present it on a third, over a wide area connection. So in addition to you guys using this document to really understand what's going on inside the regulator, it's also used by third parties when they're doing value-add offerings to the product. Okay. ASCII configuration. We finally get to it. This is an example of ASCII commands. System config alternator, 100 degrees C, 90%, 75%, 50%, 30 seconds engine warm-up delay. I know what that means because I've lived this for years and years. If you want to know what that means, you're going to go to that 100-page document and look up what SCA means. Same SCT, how many poles, what's the drive ratio? This is how you calibrate it. Charge profile alternator, overdrive, float. This is how you define the charge profile for in the Wakespeed regulator if the Wakespeed is going to drive the charge. So if the Wakespeed's the master, if the blinky lights are green, that's what's going to be followed. If the Wakespeed is a slave, that's going to be ignored. There are a couple of exceptions, and this is something for you to write down. There are a couple of exceptions where the Wakespeed will actually override what the battery tells us to do. We kind of double check stuff, and that's on this line, charge profile battery. So in here you define temperature limits, you define the C rate. We also have the ability as you're reaching the extremes to do a reduced C rate. This particular thing, and I'm just going to tell you, it will stop charging above 45 degrees C and below 5 degrees C. Just won't charge. I don't care if the BMS is asking for it. We will not honor that and we'll override it. It's a double check. If you don't want the regulator doing that, you just put zeros in for those parameters or -1s. Everyone's a little bit different. You can define it. I will also tell you this is set up for a 0.5 C rate. So we're going to limit battery current to that battery at a 0.5 C rate unless we get at temperature extremes. If we're from 42 to 45 degrees C, we're going to run this at a 0.05 C rate. It's a way for the regulator to, as the battery starts getting stressed, will slow things down. Now we purposely had a choice to either leave that line active or to have it also ignored when we're in a slave mode. We chose to leave it active because sometimes systems installers may say, I don't care if the battery is rated for a 0.5 C rate and wants a 0.5 C. I don't care if the battery is asking for a 1 C. Do you guys know what I mean when I say a C rate? No. Okay. I saw a lot of deer in the headlight stares and I didn't know if it was because of lunch. Batteries, they define things. No, I was starting to get the look like my wife gives me when I'm explaining things to her. It's like, oh, that's nice, dear. Batteries, one of the ways that they describe batteries is what they call C rates. And it's a ratio of how many amps you can take out of a battery or put into a battery. There's a discharge C rate and a charge C rate based on the battery capacity. If you have a 1 C rate battery and a 400 amp hour battery, you can stuff 400 amps into it at a time. If you have a battery that's spec'd at 0.5 C rate, that 400 amp hour battery, you can stuff 200 amps into it at a time. So C rate is a battery industry terminology used to describe how quickly you can charge or discharge a battery defined in terms of its overall capacity. Does that make sense? Okay. Very common C rate for lithium batteries, 0.5 C. Very common. We're having newer batteries coming in where they're doing barothermal management. They'll do a 1 C rate. We have lifeline batteries. I think they'll do a 1 C rate or even a 2 C rate. I mean, they'll take a ton. We have lead acid batteries. The typical battery, believe it or not, the rule of thumb is 25% of capacity. That's from sailors. If you actually look at the batteries themselves, most of them are defined as a 10%, a 0.1 C rate. So every battery manufacturer and every battery chemistry has a different C rate. What we have done here is we have the ability to say, when these batteries are getting stressed, they're reaching their upper or lower limits, we can do it also if they're highly discharged, we'll take it gentle on the battery. Even if the battery asks for more, we'll take it gentle. And we did that because sometimes customers, when they design their system, they just don't want to put the battery to its limit. They want to take it more gentle on the battery, just like you can define the lower temperature point on the alternator or lower maximum field drive on the alternator. That's how you can do that. Other times customers may say, the battery may be able to take 400 amps, but the rest of my wiring can only take 200 amps. So that's kind of why we left that active. All right, this is the gory details. If you're the guy that wants to get the text editor and edit it, that's how you create a configuration file. This is what the Wakespeed application creates, and this is what gets squirted down into the regulator when you actually configure it. Yes, sir?
What happens if you make a typo? Does it just break the device, or does it just keep you
It's a very good question. There is very limited range checking on every one of those parameters. If you make a typo and the parameter is out of sequence, you may end up with a misconfigured regulator. If you make a typo and the range, we basically on every parameter will do a range check. And that's documented in the ASCII comms guide. If you're outside of that range, then the regulator will throw a knack.
like a 9999 C rate? It won't just like
Yeah,
set my batteries on fire.
exactly. Yeah, there's limits to that, but it's not absolute. Really, you gotta be careful with this stuff. You gotta be careful you don't mess it up. Typically, if you provide a short string, the regulator will accept it because when we add new parameters, we put it on the end. So if you send the short string in, the regulator will accept it. You may have dropped the parameter in the middle and everything shifted over. It's fiddly. You have to be careful. You have to be very, very careful when you do this. All right. So I'm only showing this to you to explain how the product actually works. And I also want to point out one more thing. All of those charge profile, you may have heard me a couple of times talk about expert mode in the app. Normally you can't change that. You select the battery and it's all driven by tables and that's what you get because we've programmed it in for you. You can turn on expert mode and you can go in and mess with these numbers. And you're welcome to do it. You're going to get a little pop-up that says if Rome burns, it's on you, right? But you can do that. Here's the thing you need to know. As far as the Wakespeed regulator is concerned, the only battery that exists in the whole world is a 12-volt, 500 amp hour battery. That's it. There's no 48-volt. There's no 2,000 amp hour batteries. They don't exist. A 12-volt, 500 amp hour battery. Now, we get to those R voltages in runtime because we apply multipliers. So if you're in a 48-volt environment, all of these numbers you define here will get multiplied by 4. So like if we were in a 24-volt battery, we would actually charge toward 28.4 volts. We apply 2.0. Same with battery capacity. It's, by the way, why you can support a 32-volt vessel, because the multiplier is 2.333, I think. So you can apply these multipliers and it makes it a very flexible product. But you have to know, whenever you're working at the expert level, either doing it the hard way by editing these or in the app with expert toggle on, all of these numbers are defined as a 12-volt, 500 amp hour battery. So for example, this number right here, 250, that is defined as max battery current. 250 is half of 500, 0.5. That's how you make a 0.5 C rate. That's how you define it in here. So I want you to know that. If you do go down that path, hopefully you'll remember, oh yeah, and it's documented in the document, but just remember, that's a very important detail if you go into the expert mode on the Wakespeed app. All right. Once you have a configuration file, there's a couple of ways to get it into the regulator. The old way is you would take that text file, and you can still do it today. We have a Windows transfer tool. You download the Windows transfer tool from the Wakespeed website, unzip it, connect your Windows computer up to the Wakespeed regulator, You drop that text file into the tool, you run the update.bat file, and it will guide you through to update the regulator. We also do the same thing for firmware updates as well, based on Windows Computer. So if you've got an Apple phone, Apple device, and you're trying to create a configuration, this is one way you can get it into the Wakespeed regulator. And a little side note, yes, I had to go to the mat and explain to Apple why I made reference to a Windows computer associated with an iPhone app. They didn't like that. The other way that you can get from an iPhone into a Wakespeed regulator is to email it to an Android device. And you can import that configuration into your Android device. And then you can connect it directly and you can transfer the configuration down. And yes, I had to go to that because Apple didn't like the fact that I was mentioning Android in their iPhone app. So there are a couple of ways you can do that. We have video files. There are video learn files on how to do all of this stuff on the Wakespeed website. Do this if you have to. I'm just going to tell you, try not to do it. Don't try. We are moving away from Windows just because it's been problematic as of late. We still support it. There may be a time sometime soon when we actually pull all the Windows tools just because it's becoming more and more problematic. So anyway, what we're going to focus on now is the way that I suggest you create a Wakespeed application. There are, within the app, and why don't you guys work with me? All of you open the Wakespeed app. I'm going to swipe to open and get mine open here. If I can find it. Okay. So it'll come up, and then what you'll get is if you click on this little slide, this little home thing on the top left corner, you get this slide out. And what I want you to do is go and select the configuration. You see here we've got configuration, we've got monitor, we've got logging, we've got all the stuff, but we're going to focus on the configuration tab. So you should have a screen that looks something like this. On this screen, you define your alternator, your battery, things about the system, whether you have a shunt installed, is it backwards. You can select the BMS if there happens to be multiple BMSs. And if you want to do any of the engine stuff with the white space, you can go to that tab. That's how we've broken it down. We are going to go through right now, and I do need to get this phone here. I want to go through and create the configuration for that system that's in the back. So what I want you to do on this very first screen, and we always start with the first because that kind of, it tells us what our voltage is going to be frank. That's how we know whether we're dealing with a 12 or 24 volt system or 48. So we start with the alternator. So we have got a Lease Nouvelle Presto light. So on the very first drop down where it says brand, drop that down and pick Lease Nouvelle Presto light. And I'm all but positive you guys can't see this, but should look something like this now. Then on model, I want you to do the drop down menu, and the very last one, AVI 160. Pick that guy. Okay? The next thing that you will want to probably edit, and you'll notice this has got a little note here when you pick that alternator. It says, oh, you have to use a certain part number to convert that alternator for external regulation. So a lot of the stuff, a little note will pop up to give you hints. That's actually you can talk to Rick. He's got the magic decoder. This is actually really exciting. This is a modern alternator with a factory conversion kit, if you can get that part number. So talk to Rick to figure out how to do it, because I'm personally really excited about that. Then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to change the name. This is what's going to show up on your NEMA 2000 display. So let's just change this and call it main. So go ahead and erase where it says Wakespeed and change it to something called main. Whatever you want to do. You know, when you do your real install, you might say port, you might say starboard. It's really not relevant to how the regulator works. It's only relative to this is what's going to show up on the NEMA 2000 displays. This is what's going to show up on the servo, okay? And then, once you're done here, we're not going to go ahead and hook up stator wires. We're not going to do anything for RPM. We're just going to make a simple install. So go ahead and press next or save configuration, okay? Move on to the battery screen. And what I want you to do is pick Victron, because we've got Victron. And the battery that we're going to use is called, on the next one down, pick BAT 4121 01084. BAT 4121 BAT 4121 01084. Yep, pick that one. Boy, I love Victron. I always have to remember they're Dutch. 4121 4121 0184. Okay. I should have done this before, so I'll just pick this guy here, okay? You will then see and type, and we just have one battery, okay? In this example, if you had 2 or 3 or 4, you type the number of those batteries you have. In this case, we have 1. You're going to see a little bit of information. You're going to see a little picture here that kind of shows you how these batteries are going to be wired. And you're going to see a little summary. You have a battery bank, 12 volt at 110 amp hours. That's how big your system is. So because you've defined the voltage already, this little picture will decide if you're going to put them all in parallel or serials or a combination. It'll also indicate, it'll throw some of these boxes as red. If you picked the 24 volt system and you said you had 5 of these, it would say, I didn't know what to do with the 5th one. So it's just kind of a quick, cute check. Then the very next thing that we want to look at is down here in this gray, this is how this battery is going to be charged. It's a summary. This is what the charge profile that's built in to the Wakespeed app, the database, that's what Victron has told us how we should charge that battery. So you can kind of see this, and there's ways to change it we'll talk about later, but this is what comes from the factory. That's it. So we've picked the alternator tab, we said the make and model, we changed the name, we picked the battery tab, we picked the make and model, we said how many. Now we're going to go to the system tab. Yes, we're going to install a current shunt. It is a 500 amp, 50 millivolt shunt. And no, it's not in backwards. We added this little toggle switch here is the shunt in backwards in case you get the gray and purple wire backwards. And the way you'll know that is during your checkout, you'll do the monitor tab. And if the battery current shows up as negative when you're charging it or positive when you're discharging it, you can either crawl down into the engine room and move those wires around or just toggle this toggle. Your choice. I'll leave it up to you. Okay? Go ahead and save at this point on the engine tab, we're not going to do anything because frankly, we're not talking to an engine as a test stand. We aren't going to do anything. So let's go ahead and save configuration. And then I am going to show, I'm going to take my on-the-go cable, OTG. When you go to Amazon, you're going to search for OTG adapter. OTG USB, it has this big specification. One of the chapters in it is OTG. This is a special cable. It changes the behavior of the device you plug it into. You can't just get something that changes this connector or this connector. It must have the words, the letters, OTG, all in caps. They're like $4 on Amazon. They're like $1.50 at Alibaba, or you can get them from Dragonfly Energy for like 20. Your choice. but they're readily available. Just get one that plugs into your phone. Then you're going to take a common USB cable. Actually, this is known as a printer cable. They're very often used on the printer cables, the Type B, the big robust one. If you have one of the prior versions of the Wakespeed, you need the little micro. Be really careful when you plug it in, because if you twist this thing off, it's not covered by warranty. All right, so we'll go ahead and plug my USB cable into the bottom, and then I'm going to plug this into here. You'll notice a little symbol. You couldn't notice it, but on the far left side, there are the 3 dots. That's the stack menu. Right next to it is a little USB Trident showed up. I'll go ahead and unplug it. I don't know if you guys have good enough eyes to see this. Some of you do. Yay, I know I don't. But it goes away. When you plug it in and the app recognizes that there's something plugged in, that little symbol will show up. Down the road, that symbol may change to another symbol depending on what's going on. But this means that we're talking to the regulator, and you will notice that the LED is blinking. It's blinking green. At this point in time, what I can do is pick this stack bars, and I can pick configure device. Looks like I waited too long. I have to press the reset button. I didn't have my little symbol there, and that was grayed out. So I pressed the reset button, and now it's not grayed out anymore. It says configure device. So now it's sending that configuration to the regulator. And we wait, and we wait. And we're done. That's it. We've now configured the regulator. So if I wanted to do this quickly without talking, I'll go ahead and do it. I'm going to do new on this app. I'm going to pick the alternator. I know it's Leesonville. I know the brand is this AVR. I'll just leave it as the name is AltReg. Next, battery. It's a Victron. The model number is one of these guys down here. I'm not going to waste time looking for it. And I've only got one. Next tab, system. Yeah, I got to shine at the battery. Go ahead and save it. It's already saved already. It's saying this. Yeah, I'll go ahead and override it. You can save it as different names depending on your vessel you're doing install. I plug it in. You might get this pop-up, by the way, because sometimes this is Android saying, do you want to let this device use that connection? The answer is yes. So I plug it in, and it looks like Android's not happy. So I'll go ahead and unplug it, replug it. I hate stuff that we didn't write, that we have to depend on. Oh, my Lord. It worked the first time. So I'm going to go in and press the reset button. Ah, look, that worked. Sometimes that works better than plugging in a nut. We'll go ahead and pick the bars and squirt it down. Configure device. And aside from my little editorial comments about the pop-ups that happened and having to press the reset button, you can see this literally took 30 seconds to create a configuration. And it ain't going to matter if this is a simple lead acid battery or if it's a high connected BMS battery. It's going to take the same amount of time for basic configurations. This is the way to configure your Wakespeed regulator. So with this, we're going to break now. We're going to go into the back room, and we're going to use one of you guys who made this configuration. We're going to squirt it in to the regulator and do a live test, and we're going to play with some of these other screens as the monitoring, the logging, and then we'll come back in and talk more detail about each of those screens. Alrighty, folks. I had to get the thumbs up from the back there. We've actually covered a lot of what the app can do. At some point in time, you'll be able to sit down and do a lot of this stuff with an Android phone. You can do a lot of the configuration with the iPhone, and we're going to cover more and more of the details of it. Just play with it, and I hope you can understand why we're focusing more and more on the app. Everything we did in there, you can do with a Windows computer. You can do everything we did in there with the exception of updating firmware with an Apple computer. You just need a terminal program. All you CS guys, you just need term. That's all you need. You can cut and paste those text files into a terminal program. You'll get the A-OK if it's accepted, and you get a NAC if it isn't. You guys will know what I'm talking about, who care. It's just so much easier with the app, right? All right, so what I want to do now is just go over some of these things that we've already done a little bit. The alternator tab, why don't you go ahead and get all of your phones up again? And what I want you to do is go and go to the settings page and turn on expert mode. Now go back to the configure and go to the alternator tab. And you'll see there are rose-colored features that are unlocked. You can change some parameters now. You can change all the parameters. You're an expert. If you're going to change these, be an expert. Go and download that 100-page document and read what all these commands do so you understand what happens. Because, like for example, go ahead and click on this thing that says alternator capacity. We get this a lot. People turn on expert mode and they say, oh, I've got a 185 amp alternator. What does it say in red under that?
Uncommon to use.
You want to take a bet how many support calls get to me where somebody has entered that and they said, well, yeah, it's a 180 amp alternator. And I asked, did you read that note? They don't. And I've actually, this is probably the #1 issue where people go sideways in the app, is they'll enter alternator capacity. The Wakespeed technology started as a DC generator. As a DC generator, there's a reason for us to know how many amps the alternator can do. In this environment, we don't. It's very uncommon usage. I've actually toyed with taking that out because we have issues. However, there are certain really gnarly cases where this has been helpful. So I'm a bit on the fence with it, but I'm just going to tell you guys, RTFA, read the friggin' app. When it says uncommon use, do not put something here, don't put something there. All right, so we'll carry on here, since I've belabored that a bit. We just won't define anything. You'll notice down here, also in the rose-colored stuff, I can set the password. This doesn't mean anything today, because today we have no need to have a password if you're trying to connect this device to this device today. But who knows, maybe in the future that password will be important. There is actually a use for that password, I will tell you though. You have an ability as an expert on the system tab to lock this regulator down, to say, I don't want anybody making changes. And you can lock it down in such a way that you have to reset the regulator and issue the password. That's the value that you may choose to use to keep your customers from futzing with stuff that you spend a lot of time doing. I'll tell you another thing, that password comes out in the normal ASCII commands or in the normal ASCII status. If you take a log file, you'll see the password there, unless you put a dot in front of that name. Then that will be suppressed. All right, we've been a day and a half. I want to see who's been paying attention. I just gave you a very valuable piece of information. If I wasn't here, where would you go to learn that putting a dot in front of that password would suppress it on output?
The app or the 100-page manual?
Does it say it in the app?
No.
All right. Where would you go?
The website.
The 100-page manual. He said, he just didn't want to say it again. He's like, oh, damn, he didn't take my answer. I must have said something right. No, you said something right. You just gave me 2 answers. One was correct and one wasn't. Everything in rose color, you're an expert. You got to read that manual. Now, you don't have to read the whole thing, but you're going to have to read it enough to understand where to look for. And I'm just going to tell you, there's a command called NCP, name password config. You'll go find that section and it'll say, here's the name, and there's limits on what you can do. It'll tell you how long it is. Here's the password, and it's going to say, if you put a dot in front of it, it'll be suppressed. That's where you're going to go get that answer. I am overemphasizing this. The number one problem when a support call gets to me is people have gone into bloody expert mode and hose things up. And I just play silly. I just say, I'm kind of slow, we're going to take it all over. I have them create a new configuration from the very beginning, just like we did an hour ago. It actually takes about 45 seconds because I have to ask them some questions. We make a new configuration, a simple one. We squirt it into the regulator and, oh, by golly, it's working now. So I'll get off that particular hobby horse a bit. All right, the other thing we can do, you'll notice this alternator, you can set the alternator temperature. And in this case, it's 110 degrees C. But you notice how it's in rose color? That's because when we got the information from Lise Neville on this alternator, they told us they wanted to run at 110. So normally, we don't even give you an option. We don't even ask you that. Why should you care? We, Wakespeed, have already done the work for you. We contacted the manufacturer. They told us 110, we put it in there. If you had picked an alternator that was a generic one, that wasn't by name, you'd have to enter that, you'd be able to enter that information yourself, and you'd have to do it. But that's kind of the difference. So sometimes some of these parameters will show up in the regular mode, and sometimes they'll be hidden, and that's why. The next one, and we're going to go through every one of these, by the way, because this is all helpful information. The next one is repurpose the battery temperature as a secondary alternator temperature sensor. This actually is helpful when you've got two alternators on one engine. And remember, on our harnesses, we have got a battery temperature sensor and an alternator temperature sensor. Now, if we happen to have a CAN connected battery and the battery's already telling us the battery temperature, this one's not used. It's not needed. You can tell the regulator, use this as a second alternator temperature sensor. So if you've got two alternators, and we've seen that in a lot of those Nordhavens, two identical alternators on the same engine, you would toggle that on, you'd put another little short temperature sensor, you put this on one alternator and this one on the other one, and what the Wakespeed will do is it'll pick the hottest. And that's how it'll manage the alternator temperature. So that's kind of a neat little feature that you can do. Small alt mode, this is just like turning on dip switch 8. If you don't have a regulator without dip switch 8, it's just like turning dip switch 8 on. Adjust max field drive. This is the live rail of alternator regulators. As you remember, we talked about field wire, the stator wire and the tachometer dropping out because you weren't driving it. Go ahead and toggle that button that says adjust max. Oh, I'm sorry. This is max field drive. Oh, that's okay. I got ahead of myself, sorry. Adjust max field drive. Go ahead and toggle that on. And you can see here, for this alternator, we do 100%, 75%, and 50%. That is normal, small alt mode, and half power mode by default. You can change those anything you want. Often when I do an install, I'll drive alternators to 90%, just to be a little more gentle on them. But alternator manufacturers don't like us being gentle on their alternator. They want to see their alternator outperform other ones. So that's why we do 100%. So that is actually something that you might want to consider adjusting in your own respect. I will tell you another little detailed hint. We have the ability, this is super advanced capabilities, but you'll see this used in some of our configurations. The white feature in has the ability to select half power mode. Do you remember me talking about that? If you put 0% in for half power mode, that will tell the regulator to go into standby. It's a way to turn the regulator off without turning it off. And the areas where we've seen this done, we have one battery where we receive proprietary battery information. We translate it into RVC and present that for the whole world to use. Well, they want to see that translation happen all the time, not just when the engine's running. So in that install, what they did is they connected the brown wire to the 12-volt power source. So the Wakespeed's always active, 724. Then they connected the white wire to the key switch. And when the key switch, and they actually selected as inverted. So when you apply power, if no power is here, the regulator will be in half power mode. 0%, standby. When you apply power here, we'll be released from half power mode and we'll go into normal mode. There's a little bit of thinking there and logic, but it shows some of the flexibility and things you can do with the Wakespeed. We have the ability to drive DC to DC converters, sometimes that's used that way. Anytime you have a need to run the regulator for some reason other than driving an alternator all the time, this is a technique you can use to make sure the regulator knows when the engine's actually running or not. It's a rather esoteric use, but I'm sure you guys, if you ever have a need to do it, you might, hopefully you'll remember this and go, what was it he said? All right, use RPMs to sense the stator wire. This is a normal thing. If you toggle that on, two things are going to happen. It's going to ask you whether you want to calibrate the WS500, and this is where you get to put in things such as the number of poles and the pulley ratio. It also opens up this thing called minimum field drive, and you'll notice right now that's in white. We're moving that to expert mode. That's the thing that's hazardous. This is what I was starting to go down my rant on, where the tachometer dies. Right now you'll notice it says 0, so that means it'll let the regulator go all the way to 0%. If we have to shut the alternator off, we'll shut it off. However, if you have a customer that wants to keep their tach wire live, you might put 1% or 2% here. So we won't shut the alternator all the way off, we'll shut it sort of off. Please only use that with lead acid batteries. You can fine-tune stuff with lithium, but it is super dodgy and super risky. Just tell customers, sorry, that's the nature of the beast, and find another solution for your tachometer. Move the tach wire to the ship's alternator, get a physical alternator, get a tiny tach, get something that senses off the flywheel, whatever it is, find another solution. Adaptive idle pullback. This was something that we're probably going to depreciate in the regulator. This was an early attempt at white space, but it only focused on the low end side. White space is a much rarer way to do it, so this one I'm just going to tell you ignore. Use RPMs to select half power. Who made the question about what happens if the engine stops running? That was you. This is how you could do that. You would do that by two things. One, hopefully you're getting RPMs in a stable way. You would say, you know what? If this engine is ever under 100 RPMs, it's probably not running. So you type 100 here, and then you go up to your half power, and you type 0 in. So guess what? If the regulator ever senses that the engine RPMs are below 100 RPMs, we'll go into standby mode. That is how you would deliver that value. Not only helpful on situations where you have a failure in the engine, but these vans that have the auto start stop at traffic lights, that's how we solve the issue. That when the engine has stopped at the traffic light, we don't end up burning up the alternator. I'm going to pause for a little minute and see if that clicks with some people. I'm not seeing nods. Okay, if you want to learn more about how to do that, I'll be happy. We're really covering the details. Hopefully this stuff's going to be on video, and you can kind of go into it more details. So if we go to the battery, you'll see the battery that you selected. If we scroll down, there's a new thing in the rose color that says adjust battery profiles. And this one, when you toggle it on, you're going to get the Rome is going to burn. And when it burns, it's your fault. So click and say, okay. And you remember all those commands of CPA and CPO and CPF and CPB? Let's go ahead and twist open that CPB. And we can see the max bat amps that's been defined for this. We can see parameters such as the high temperature, the low temperature. It's a lead acid, so the temperature compensation's in here. You can go through and change every single parameter as you want to in this particular place. Okay? If we go on to the systems, boy, I tell you what, there's a whole bunch of rose-colored stuff in systems. I'm not going to go over every one, but I'll just give a summary. Advanced options. This is some of that reliability stuff. So do you want to require there to be a CAN connected? And if BMS, and if it's not there, what do you want the regulator to do? Do you want it to go into a degraded mode, or do you want it to go into a fault mode? Every one of these has got a default behavior, and you can override it through a hard fault. Where would you go to find the default behaviors for this expert feature? Yes, exactly. Thank you. We also have an area, and this is actually kind of interesting. We have this area called ignore sensors. And sometimes you aren't hooking the sensor up. Sometimes you're not hooking up the current shunt because you're getting it from the battery. Sometimes you're not hooking up the stator wire. And what you can do is you can declare to ignore those sensors, and that will prevent any random information from sneaking in and causing mischief inside the regulator. Normally those things are largely set automatically. For example, if you want on the alternator tab and I said I don't care to sense RPMs, we will automatically ignore the stator wire. If you're on a CAN connected BMS, and we know it's going to be CAN connected BMS, we will say ignore the battery ignore the current shunt. And we may even say ignore the battery temperature sensor, depending on what the capability is that's coming in. So a lot of that stuff's set automatically, but this is where you can go and verify them if you need to. We have a lot of other type of features. Oh, look at here where it says select system lockout option. And you can go and see the SCO command, and you can say prevent changes to the Wakespeed regulator unless you issue a reset command with the password.
So it's worth mentioning that in the CAN options, that's where you can be an expert mode. You can change the baud rate.
Correct. Yeah, we'll get down to there. All right, so now we're moving down on the regulator options. Remember I talked about instances? This is where you define the regulator instance. You got a twin engine that's going to be instance 1 and 2. Now, truth be told, the Wakespeeds, because they know about each other, they're brothers, if they see 2 regulators with the same instance, they'll automatically bump it. So reality is you don't have to worry about it. But if you have a very specific reason for knowing that the port is 1 and the starboard's 2, you can explicitly declare them this way if you want to. Otherwise, they'll just automatically pick one, and they'll stay that way. How should the feature and wire behave? So this is different options that the feature and wire can do. Again, go to the Bible to figure out what they do. How should the feature out wire behave? Should it be act as a just solid light if there's an error? Should it we can use this to indicate a diesel generator to start running because the battery wants charging. We can actually use it to enable a heater. We know when the battery's too cold, and if you want to enable a heater, that's another thing it can do. Engine warm-up delay, that's at 30 seconds. You can make it as small as 15 or make it larger if you want to. Engine ID, this is another one of those instances. If you got a port in the starboard, you're going to have to look at the instance ID to associate the regulator with each one. Go to the Bible. There is a difference between instances on RVC and NEMA 2000. One of them starts the numbers at 0. The other one starts the numbers at 1. So it's actually an RVC, it's J1939. It's going to be 0 and 1 for J1939, and for NEMA 2000, it's going to be 1 and 2. You're entering numbers here, and it's documented in our manual, as J1939 instances. But no, when you set up those NEMA 2000 gateways, you're going to set it up as 1 and 2. And that's all commented in some of the details. CAN controller options. Again, instances for the batteries, right? We have got, do you want to enable RVC? Remember we talked about that. You could disable it if you want to. This is where you can do the CAN baud rate. So you can select the baud rate if you're going to use something different than what is normal and standard. This second to the last one, different CAN protocols. This is where all of the different alternative CAN protocols that we support that are documented are listed. So you can see we support SMA, we support Victron VE CAN, that would be example of the links. Also, that's the MG Energy. We support the Discover batteries. We support Lithium Vox. We also support Lux. I mean, you can go through this whole list. You can see there's actually quite a few of these, and it's a growing list. You'll see this thing with zero output technology. This is a unique feature. What this means is when the battery's full and you're in float, rather than turning the regulator off, which some people do, we will manage the battery current to be 0 amps. It leaves the alternator active, so if you've got an air conditioner pulling 2,000 watts, we'll supply that power for the air conditioner from the alternator, but make sure the battery doesn't get any more energy put into it. That's what's been coined zero output technology. Contrast to some competitive solutions, because they can't manage current. When the battery's full, they'll just turn the alternator off. So you're drawing 2,000 watts out of your battery and discharging your battery, cycling it up and down. That's what zero output technology means. You can choose whether you want to deliver that value or not. Okay? And then last one we got, enable. Any questions so far? I know, this is a whole lot. We started real simple, it took 30 seconds, and now we're in the deep end. Yes, ma'am?
I noticed on like some of the rose-colored profiles, like I wouldn't see a number, and then I would click on it, and then it would automatically keep a number there. Is that kind of just the default setting?
Usually it is, yeah. That'd usually be the default. What you want to do anytime you're entering any of these rose color areas is have that 100-page document there. You'll have to find what specific command it is. They're broken out, like if it's a tachometer thing, it's probably on the set configured tachometer. If it's a system or a battery, you'll have to find out where it is. But you'll kind of understand what that command's doing, what that parameter is doing, and you can read the description. It's usually a paragraph or two, or sometimes half a page, depending on how in-depth it is. Okay? Yes, sir?
So is there a different manual for different versions, or, I mean, should that be the same, all those different setups, are they described the same way, or should you update the manual when you do an update version?
When we release a version of firmware, the question was, is there a correlation between the firmware and the manuals? When we release firmware, we release a manual with it. And in an update to this document. And in there, the very beginning of it, it'll talk about what's changed, what we've added. It's really rare that we depreciate stuff, that we take things out. Really rare. We try to maintain backwards compatibility. So the new stuff will be added in the manual. We'll try to update the app to coincide in the same way so they're all kind of in lockstep. Now, I'll give you an example of something we took out. That ability to lock out, where you can prevent from people from making changes unless you issue a reset command with the password. We actually had another level that you could not reset the regulator. And some computer science guy thought, oh, our customers want that option. They thought it was a great idea, so they put it in. I'm not going to say who it was, but in the real world, our customers were saying, we never use that, and sometimes we pick it by accident. What do we do? Because now we have a brick. And the answer was you had to send it back to the factory to be reset. So our customers said, interesting idea, you pinhead of no value, take it out. So we took it out. Used to be you had 2 levels of lockout, now you only have 1. And when we made that change, we made in the firmware that if a regulator was locked out at the higher level, it would be bumped down to the resettable one. We just removed that whole feature. It's very rare that we take features out. The very next one that's on the chopping block is this pullback. We'll probably go take it out of the app because the white space is a better way to do it. We'll probably leave it in the regulator in case somebody's in the field and already using it. Okay? And if you want to know what pullback factor is, go ahead and read the document. And when your eyes are glazed over, because mine get glazed over with it, you'll realize why. Yeah, white space is a better way to do it. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Got a customer we're considering the Wakespeed, and it's a World Cruiser.
Yes.
Would you recommend buying a secondary Wakespeed or a spare?
Yes. And this is what my recommendation is. They should buy a secondary Wakespeed regulator. You as an installer should configure it for them. You should make sure they have an Android tablet. And both the secondary Wakespeed and the Android should go in the Lightning box with the handheld EPIRB and the VHF. as a world cruiser, the single issue we have, failure modes in the field, is lightning strike. You never know what's going to die or live or die. We have one installer that always installed 2 regulators online. They had 2 alternators, 2 regulators. You don't need to do that. If you have 2 alternators of the same size and capacity, 1 regulator is going to drive it. All those Nordhavens, that was done. 2 large 280 amp alternators stacked right on top of each other. 1 regulator driving it, and we actually use this feature because it was CAN connected. We use this with 2 temperature sensors. We had one installer that would always sell a second regulator and install 2 regulators. And I've gone around and around with him because his statement was his redundancy is unreliability. You know, it's redundancy. Well, lightning strike's going to be your most likely issue. You're going to take both of them out. Have your spare in the box. I will also tell you, our pseudo-military customers carry a spare. It's inside the EMP box for exactly the same reason. Well, not exactly the same reason, but instead of lightning, if something else takes out all the electronics on the vehicle, it's right there next to the spare engine computer and stuff. So yeah, my answer is, as a world cruiser, you absolutely should carry. You should also make sure you've got an Android tablet with them in some way. Make sure they got the cables, make sure they have the configuration files, and pre-configure it for them. Okay? All right. Now the moment you've all been waiting for, the engine tab. The easy way. Hook up your CAN bus to the engine, single engine, J1939, twin engines, you're going to have to go through NEMA, and define that tab. So go ahead and go on your app, swizzle over to the engine tab, and say, yes, I wish to define max engine load, and type in 60. 60, my experience, that's actually not a bad number. You'll have to adjust, obviously, to match the situation. But guess what? With that right there alone, you've delivered the value of, you can do the hydraulic pump, you can do the low speed maneuvering, you can do the power over the hump, you can make sure you don't overload the engine at the high end, you can make sure your really expensive Sprinter van with a teeny little turbo diesel engine is actually able to start up the hill. All that stuff you can do with this one parameter. That is, I think, the best way, but you got to give the regulator data with the CAN. If you can't do that, then we'll do the second best way. We'll go ahead and say, do you want to use white space? And here you have a choice. The next choice is, do you want it always enabled? Or do you want to make it so that it's only enabled when the feature in wire is used? So if you want it to be always enabled, turn that thing on. If you toggle it on, if you want it to be only when the feature in wire is active and white space will be overlaid, you can do that. This is useful in that scenario like where you've got a hydraulic pump that's also on that engine and a way to signal to the regulator that it needs to reduce stuff back. Of course, another way you might address that is you might choose to have the feature in wire select half power mode and declare a percentage value of like 40% for the alternator at half power mode. There is a couple of subtleties here. You'll notice that when you selected the options for the feature in wire, it did not present an option that said, do you want this to control white space? You'll notice on here, it says, do you want white space to always be enabled or only when feature in is active? White space is an overlay. All the rest of the stuff that the regulator normally does, this is an overlay. You can set the feature in wire to select half power mode with that feature in wire. And if you toggle this, it will also control whether white space is enabled or not. It's an overlay. It's an addition. Same thing with these sliders. When we get down to that point, that's an overlay. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and go back to your app. And you'll enter the maximum engine RPMs, and let's say 3,600. And remember, you got to get RPMs into this regulator somehow. Hopefully you can figure that out. Okay? Now, here are those little sliders, and just so you don't accidentally press them, you actually have to click this little box over here to enable the sliders. So now you can slide the sliders up and down. And what this means, like here, I'm showing 10% for the lowest RPM. This doesn't mean that the regulators only drive the alternator at 10%. What it means is it's only going to let the alternator produce 10% of what it thinks it should do. It's an overlay. This is a kind of a struggly concept, but there's reasons for it. So if the regulator has decided, because of all the input, that it should drive the alternator to 90%, we'll only let it go to 10% of that. We'll only let it drive to 9. Okay? It's an overlay. And all the other parameters that the regulator uses to decide what it should do, the white space gets applied as kind of a layer right in between it to modify that decision before it actually gets out to the alternator. It's a kind of a hard concept to get around, and we struggled with what to do. We settled with this. There's some good reasons for it. There's some really niche cases that make sense for it. Yes, ma'am.
I think I have a general understanding of why you would adjust that, but would you give us an example of why you might want to adjust, for example, the initial, like, from 0 RPMs to up to 50%?
We're going to do that right now. So what we're going to do, this all came about when I first learned about this. Some guy in Sweden, he had a little one-lunger, 9 horsepower engine for his auxiliary to get in and out. And he put like a 190 amp alternator on it. He couldn't move. He said he put it in gear and he advanced the throttle and the engine's RPMs wouldn't come up. It was just so overloaded at that. So we're going to make a curve for him. You know what? He doesn't have a problem at the high end, but at the low end he does. So we're just going to play with this, and maybe at the very low end we're only going to let 10% be, and then as RPMs come up, and that's between 450 and 900, we'll let the regulator do 25%. And then as you get higher up, we'll let it do 100%. You know, we'll keep moving up, we'll shape it. So what we've got is an engine that can't produce enough power at the low end, so we're going to restrict the alternator output at the low end, and that's what your curve would look like. Does this show well, or do I need to use Air Tablet? Can you guys kind of? Okay. Now, let's take another example. Let's say we have one of these go-fast boats. One of these go-fast boats, and you hear them, they got the lopey engines, and when they put the throttle in gear, the boat jumps forward because it's got so much low-end torque. You know what? He doesn't need any help at the low end. So we're just going to leave those all the way up. However, this is a go-fast boat. And the guy who designed this made it so when you're at max RPM, so when you firewall at the throttle, you're putting all that horsepower into the prop. The prop curve, load curve, has matched the engine output curve. So at the high end, we're going to back off, we're going to back off the alternator. We're going to do like, I don't know, 5%. And then maybe just a little bit before that, we're going to do a little percentage like this. And what will happen if we don't do that, because we've got these big alternators on here that are pulling 20, 30 horsepower of it, we'll overload the engine and get black smoke out the back. So this is your massive go-fast boat. Now, let's take an example of somewhere in between. We've got a boat with kind of a modest engine. You know, it maybe needs a little, it struggles a little bit at the low end. So maybe we'll just limit it at the low end, 40%. And at the high end, we got kind of the same condition because the output and the alternator loading matches. So we'll leave the high end the same, but this guy's struggling to get on step. And we have figured out that this boat tries to get on step right around 1200 RPMs. So I'm going to take that slider that's got 1200 RPMs and I'm going to pull it back. So that's going to reduce the alternator load on that engine while we're trying to get the boat up on step. There's 3 examples for you. Now, when you got a boat like mine that I can only put 42 horsepower in, and I've got a big torquey inline 6 Cummins engine, that's what my curve's going to look like. Actually, I'm not even going to turn on white space because I don't worry about it, right? So this is what lets you fine tune the loading if you can't gain access to engine. Does that answer your question? I think we are done with how to configure the Wakespeed regulator. Before I move on and before I go over here and look at my slide deck to make sure, are there any questions about using the Wakespeed app to create a configuration, for sending that configuration down to the regulator? You'll notice these things are grayed out. That's because I'm not connected to a regulator. They're not enabled. When you plug it in and it works, those things will become available to you to select. The sharing we talked about, the importing, when you share a configuration, oh, here's a little hint. When you share a configuration with someone, you're going to get two files. You're going to get a text file and a JSON, a JSON file. The text file is what actually gets squirted into the regulator. The JSON file is what you want the customer to import. And the reason why is that JSON file has all the rich details such as the brand, the name, how many batteries there are, what brand they are, whereas the text file only has the raw stuff the regulator needs to know about. Yes, ma'am?
So if you do what we talked about before, which is have your customer get a feeder Android phone and they want to share the file,
Yeah.
how do they do that if they don't have a cell phone plan? Is it possible?
Yeah, you just hook it up to Wi-Fi.
Okay. They can't download it though? Well, I guess, what if they don't have Wi-Fi and they're using their other phone to text you?
Well, then they turn their other phone into a hotspot.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not here to solve your IT issues. I retired from the computer industry. I hate computers. Okay? You call Elon Musk and order one of those fancy satellite things. And, all right? All right. We added this thing. It's kind of hidden here. It says confirm device. You can press it if you want to. If the regulator says it sent it down, because every time it sends a line down, you get an actual confirmation back from the regulator. But we added that because people say, well, how do I know if the regulator is confirmed? I will tell you there's a bug in the current release of the app, and it's being fixed in the next one. The current release of the app is very literal. So if we have a parameter that says 2.500, and we get back 2.50, that confirm will say, those don't match. So we told the regulator that trailing zeros really don't matter, or the app that trailing zeros don't matter. In the next release, 1.7, that'll get addressed. Okay. We've talked about these slide out features and we demonstrated them all. You saw how you use them to configure the regulator, to do the device settings, to do the system settings. We didn't really do too much on the updating of the device in terms of specifically the firmware update, but you can play with that on your desktop. You can just update the firmware. I'll tell you, in normal mode, you will always get the latest firmware. It will go out and poll the regulator and ask what the firmware that's in the regulator is, and it will compare versions. If you need to update it, it'll tell you you should update it. If you're in expert mode, you can do that, or you have the ability to sideload in different firmware versions. You may get a really gnarly situation where you have somebody send you a trial version of firmware, or where you, for some reason, choose to do a down rev version of firmware. And you've contacted our support and they've sent you a DFU file. That's the file that has the firmware. Going into expert mode is what lets you select that DFU file and send it into the regulator. Otherwise, you're only going to get the latest version. Hints. I guarantee you we've covered all of these things back in the room. We use the monitor tab for the initial checkout. You guys saw how we did that. We used the monitor tab to verify in the static mode that the regulator was able to see battery voltage and current. You could also see that there were no temperature sensors hooked up. So probably those are important, so hook those up. If you have a CAN connected, you can see it. You can see the color shift. This is all static without the engine running. Just plug in the USB port, because remember, in addition to communicating, that USB will power the logic side. So it's a way to test out all the stuff of the regulator, right? We talked about the logging screen. We talked about the system screen. We talked about expert mode unlocks different features on all of these screens. My recommendation is that you spend 20 seconds and look at that stuff. Do a quick test before you turn on the key switch. Just give it a stiff test, make sure it works. Do you guys, how many of you are video game guys? Do you understand what cookie means? In video games, and first off, I'm not a gamer. I just don't have the patience for it. But I am told what a cookie means is sometimes developers will hide something. A little special feature. Ooh, you can get an extra powerful big gun. Or a rose, I don't know what it is. But you get something that's beneficial if you like do a certain thing. In the Wakespeed application, when you're on the configuration screen, the edit screen, on the bottom there, there's that save or next. If you press and hold that, a little window will pop up and all those raw ASCII commands will come out in real time. And if you are the person who has read, yes, I'm looking at you, if you are the person who has read that manual and you want to see the ASCII commands in real time and you don't want to be bothered to go over to the monitor tab and have the app parse that and put it in dials and gauges, but you want to see the real stuff, that's how you can see it. And if you're a guy like me, because I've been doing it forever, I'll often go and use that because it's like, oh, I can see what's going on. The nice thing about it is it gives you a little trend. It's the same data you're going to see in the log files, and you can see like a mini trend because I think we display like about 20 lines. So you can kind of see a trend that's going on in that.